This is in a Japanese department store. HTML is a brand of clothing in Tokyo. But I couldn't resist lying on the floor to the consternation of the shop assistants. Yep, I'm Bruce, and I'm an HTML alcoholic. And I'm here to talk about Shokunin. Shokunin is a Japanese word, usually defined as craftsman or artisan, if English isn't your first language. An artisan is a worker in a skilled trade, especially one involved in making things by hand. Let's talk about Japan. They have great, elaborate toilets. I was in a friend's house and I really couldn't work out how to flush the toilet after I had a pee, and I was terribly worried. And then I realized that if I just moved away, it would flush. This one squirts water at you from various different directions, and I was doing a conference in Tokyo, so I went to the ladies' toilet the day before to check out that it is true that you can press a button and it makes the sound of water flushing to mask the sound of urination, but it's only the sound so as not to waste water because they're efficient. In Tokyo, I could walk around the corner and meet a geisha on my way to the Godzilla statue, clutching my party joke gaijin mask with a gigantic stick-on nose and blue eyes, so you can look like a Westerner. And you can walk down the road chatting with a robot all in one morning. Robots, if you've watched The World's End with Simon Pegg, etc., you will know that a robot is a machine, especially one programmable, capable of carrying out a complex series of actions automatically. Robots in your life. Maybe you have a sat-nav in your car. You probably have a washing machine that you can set to do a complex wash. There will be a coffee machine and a TiVo and a VCR or something like that. Robots you work with, code linters and validators. These are robots. They perform a complex series of tasks for you. CSS grid gradient animation generators. These are robots. SAS and Less. These are robots that write CSS for you. Babel, Webpack. These are all robots that you work with. So robots can be really helpful until they start to put people out of work. In the 19th century, the Luddites smashed up spinning machines because they were putting people out of work. And don't forget that our industry puts people out of work as well. House of Fraser went into bankruptcy, citing competition from Amazon and online stores, the things that we make. The World Bank, in their landmark 2016 report on digital dividends, showed that so many jobs across the world are going to be lost to automation. From a technological standpoint, fewer than half of today's school children in China, Croatia, or Thailand can expect to find a job in an occupation that even exists today. Morning, you've missed the good bits. No, I was good until now. The World Bank says over the centuries, societies have adapted to massive changes in the labour markets, the biggest being the shift out of agriculture. For example, in 1910, there were 12 million farm workers in the US. 100 years later, there are only 700,000 farm workers in a population 3 times larger. And no industry is immune. We are being chased by robots too. A Smashing Magazine article was talking about these website builders, Squarespace, Wix, Weebly, etc., etc. People can make their own website and host them on a massive hyper up set of servers owned by somebody else for pretty much less than I pay to host my WordPress site myself. Disclosure here, although it says on the program I work for Wix, I don't. I was a contractor on web standards and open source and fashion advice. I didn't work on the consumer products, and I no longer have any connection with Wix financially, so I can talk about them, and I'm not trying to plug anything. Oh, well, you say, the Wix and things, they just make brochure websites for hobbyists. That's true. There's a thing called ADI at Wix. You answer a few questions, you drag and drop some template stuff around, you give it your social media credentials, and it will go and drag content that you created elsewhere and make a website. That's great. Oh yeah, but we make complex websites. That's not being replaced. Oh yeah, but Wix Code, which has come out last year, this basically allows people who already have a Wix website to make it hugely database driven as an app with a special set of sandboxed APIs and some JavaScript that looks very much like simple jQuery. So this is going to replace a lot of our work. What can we do? Well, one of the things you can do is become artisanal. Artisanal is pertaining to, or the characteristics of an artisan. It is not pronounced art is anal, as I thought. I thought this was a reference to Mr. Garfunkel's legendary attention to detail and perfectionism, but it's not. It's nothing to do with him. It's to do with the hipster coffees that probably... Anybody here from London? Okay, so you probably live in a place that makes this kind of thing. These hipster coffees, these avocado on toast, so beloved of people like this. Look how sad they are because they can't afford a fucking house because they spent all their money on avocado toast and coffee. Bless them. It's easy to sneer, but don't. In an article last year in the New York Times, it said, don't mock the artisanal pickle makers. Instead of our rolling our eyes at self-conscious Brooklyn hipsters pickling everything in sight, we might look to them as guides to the future of the American economy. Many of the manufacturers who are thriving in the US, they exist, I swear, have done so by avoiding direct competition with low-cost commodity producers in low-wage nations. Instead, they've scrutinized the market and created customized product for less price-sensitive customers. And I suggest that this is how you can survive the increasing automation of web development, web design, by doing it better than the machines can, by using craftsmanship to make better sites than the machines. In his book, Japanese Woodworking Tools, which I weirdly read, even though I don't care about woodwork, the guy who wrote it, and my glasses are not strong enough to let me read his name, Tasio Odate, said, a shokunin means not only having technical skill, but also implies an attitude and social consciousness, a social obligation to work as best for the general welfare of the people, an obligation both material and spiritual. A shokunin will have a little area in his or her house in order to store their tools. The tokonoma, traditionally, they honoured the tools of their trade at New Year's. They put the tools in a tokonoma with 2 rice cakes and a tangerine on top of rice paper to honour their toolbox. Now, this is interesting to me because we in web design and web development get terribly hung up on tools. I see job ads that ask you to know about Webpack and Babel and jQuery or Angular or Ember or whatever. But these are only tools. You shouldn't get too hung up on them. I'm not scared of them, although in Bucharest I saw this graffiti saying, React, run. I'm not actually scared of the tools. I just don't fetishize them. I don't care whether you use Ember, Webpack, Angular, React, Embegular, Bonestrap, Hubpack.js. Use what you want, but remember, they're only tools. Okay, they are huge, well-known tools, but nevertheless, they're only tools. What you should care about is the raw materials that you are working with, not the tools with which you shape them. And the raw materials are, of course, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, and they are different things. Because I have an ego the size of Heathrow Airport, here's a picture of Brendan Ike, who invented JavaScript, Malcolm William Lee, who invented CSS, and me, I didn't invent HTML, I merely invented the picture element. HTML, of course, was invented by Sir Uncle Tim. Uncle Timbo said famously, this is for everyone, and it is, unless we decide to limit the audience. As Sarah said yesterday, Things are accessible and responsive by default unless you choose to make them not so. Core strengths of the web, according to Uncle Timbo: it's universal, it's open, it's decentralized, and there's the principle of least power that we forget too often. So let's look at universal. You've probably seen me do this before. There are more human beings alive inside this circle than there are outside the circle. The population of the West is diminishing. The population of the East is increasing. By 2050, Asia will be 2 billion people. By 2100, Africa will go from 1 billion human people to 5 billion, while the population of the West will diminish. The next people coming to the web, the next people looking at your site will be from there. So you need to service them. Southeast Asia is the fastest growing internet market in the world, 480 million users by 2020. Indonesia is the fastest growing nation on the internet in the world. Popular Indonesian online site Blibli has more than 1/3 of its 2.5 million customers living in rural areas. 75% of users are on 2G or GSM Edge. More than half of Indonesian smartphone users say they experience network difficulties daily. But these are the people coming to the web. These are the people who will come and buy your products or services. Let's have a look. In Asia, 38% of people are not on mobile phone, 45% have mobile internet, and 17% have voice text only. That's the Indonesian figures. Here's the Thai figures. There's the Philippines. There's Vietnam. You cannot assume that everybody has super fast broadband when you squirt down your 2 megabytes of JavaScript and expect a low-powered Android phone to unpack that, parse it, execute it, render it. Do not be these people. Not everybody runs Chrome. I know, right? Not everybody runs Chrome. Shocking. Stripe will not even allow their web developers to test on other browsers, locking out hundreds of millions of people. And you don't want to do that. You never know where your next customers will come from. This is Igniter. It was a dating site set up by 4 Jewish guys in New York. And they were kind of Orthodox conservative Jews. So their take on dating was that Orthodox conservative Jews wouldn't necessarily meet up man and woman one-to-one because of religious reasons. So it was group dating. 10 guys, 10 girls would go out to the cinema or to the theatre together. But it didn't reach critical mass, and they were going to turn off the servers until they noticed they were getting more visits a day from India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Pakistan than they were getting a year in the States. And the reason, I suggest, is that traditional, maybe conservative Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu families also like this group dating model. So they upped sticks, moved to Mumbai, changed their name to Stepout, and became India's biggest dating site. But if you'd said to these 4 middle-class Jewish guys in New York, what's your India-Pakistan strategy, they would have said, we don't have one. They didn't even think about it. Of course they didn't. But the reason that it became big is because it was on the web. It wasn't an iPhone app. It was on the web, which is global. It worked in every browser. People found it, and they were successful. Of course, when they were localizing Stepout for the Indian market, they had loads of things to consider. The Seinfeld references for their Jewish audience, would they work? Should you translate the site to Hindi? And what is group dating in Hindi? Should they ask users about their caste? What kind of offline partnership should there be? What about mobile devices? And 70% of payments subscribers tried to make didn't work because of problems with the credit card system. What to do about that? They decided in the end you could carry on using the site, but you couldn't send messages until your credit card payment had gone through. And this is kind of an interesting paradox. How to localize what's global. the World Bank said successful online platforms can't be transplanted necessarily to a foreign country without adapting to the local market and institutions. Flipkart, which is a kind of Amazon beta out of Bengaluru in India, they were successful because they teamed up with the dabawalas, the people who take people's lunch to their workplace after their wives have made it in the morning. They're not necessarily able to read or write, but they can get anything to anywhere in the labyrinth of an Indian city. So Flipkart used these people to deliver packages, and it worked. Tech in Asia said, given the number of unbanked people in the region, plus the popularity of shopping as a weekly leisure activity, new brands will need to turn to brick and mortar spaces. So whereas in the West, we're seeing brick and mortar being threatened by online, we're actually seeing online retailers opening brick and mortar sites because that works in their markets. And unbanked is a big thing in Asia. Last week, I was here on a small island 5 hours away from Bangkok called Koh Samet. And just by the entrance to the national park where I have my little bungalow, there were 2 7-Eleven convenience stores. And the 7-Eleven convenience stores have a huge part to play in Thai payment systems. Thailand is not unbanked. In fact, everybody was given a bank account by the government, but most people don't use them. But credit card usage is very low, and the reason for that is they had no consumer protection law. So if your credit card is stolen, you ring up the provider and you are not liable for anything after that. In Thailand, you are liable for anything that happens on your credit card in perpetuity. Therefore, nobody has a credit card. But what do you do about online payments? Well, if you buy an internal flight or something, you are given a QR code that you print out or you take on your mobile. You take it to the 7-Eleven, they scan it, you pay the cash, the retailer is alerted, and you pay 5 baht transaction fee. And this works fine. But it means that nobody will ever get a credit card now in Thailand because this system exists and the 7-Elevens are everywhere. eBay versus Taobao. eBay entered the Chinese market in 2003. eBay were dominant, and then Taobao accounted for 80% of the Chinese consumer-to-consumer market because eBay exited unsuccessfully. Taobao is owned by Alibaba. Their success can be explained, at least in part, by their ability to adapt to local market conditions to remove the information asymmetries unique to the Chinese C2C market. For example, on Taobao, sellers and buyers can communicate instantly through online messaging system. Okay, this is all very well and good. What can you take away from this? Don't do this. This is an airline booking site that I was using for real. Don't do this, because if you type in the first name, your first name, the letters will be red. And in Southeast Asia, don't write somebody's name in red because it means that you want them to die. I am not an MBA, but I suggest that wishing your customer dead is not conducive to a happy and harmonious ongoing business relationship. Why does it mean this? Because, and this is what an old person in Thailand told me when I asked them last week, because when somebody dies, they are not cremated straight away. Their remains are stored for 100 days for people to make merit for their soul. And the coffin is put in a storeroom in the temple, and the name of the deceased is written in red on the coffin. And therefore, writing somebody's name in Southeast Asia in red is to wish them dead. And don't do this. Don't require a last name. This is my friend Putri in Jakarta, Indonesia. Her name is Putri. Her Twitter handle is @onlyputri. She has no last name. Her name is Putri, which means princess. So requiring these people to have a last name is insulting them. And insulting your customer is rarely the beginning of a harmonious business relationship. Don't sue me, I'm not an MBA. Use the right tools. This is pretty obvious, but we consistently get this wrong, and we're getting it wronger and wronger. So Uncle Timbo said, one of the great things about the web is the principle of least power. The low power end of the scale is typically simpler to design, implement, and use. But the high power end of the scale has all the attraction of being open-ended hook into which anything can be placed. Therefore, it's more complex. So don't use JavaScript to do the job of HTML. Don't use JavaScript to do the job of CSS. Use the thing that has the least power, because then it will be faster. And when your customers are on 2G in rural Indonesia on a crappy network, that is a business advantage. 13 million requests for JavaScript will time out, says Ian Feather. Our monitoring tells us that 1% of requests for JavaScript at BuzzFeed time out. That's 13 million requests a month. And BuzzFeed is pretty much a Western-only thing. These are people like us who are not getting the JavaScript. This is my friend Stuart Langridge. Everyone has JavaScript, right? Nope. There are loads of reasons why you don't have JavaScript now. You might not have turned it off. You might only have got half the JavaScript that the site sent, but therefore you don't have JavaScript. Coming soon in mobile Chrome, if data saver on a user is on a 2G network or slower, Chrome will disable all JavaScript. Yet, people think that consumers shouldn't even have the right to turn off JavaScript. So my friend Charlie Owen, she said, 38.9% of developers don't understand they're developing for the diverse and beautiful World Wide Web and not some homogeneous, shiny app store. And this is the big fight, JavaScript versus the core languages of the web, HTML and CSS. I read an interesting article yesterday, actually, that said that the dismissing of CSS and the urge to make everything JavaScript was not actually a technological choice. It was about gender imbalance and trying to exclude people. I'm still processing that, but I think there's merit to that argument. People can be dismissive of CSS. It's just CSS is common to hear, like HTML barrier is low. But am I an expert carpenter if I know how to bang a nail? One of the guys behind, Styled Components, gave this quiz. How well do you know CSS? Given this classes, what color will these divs be? Well, this is not a test, have a think. They will both be blue by the rules of CSS. Because the order of the class names in the HTML doesn't matter. And in CSS, the lastmost declaration will win, and the lastmost declaration is color blue. But 40-odd% of people didn't know that, and that's okay. It's fine not to know. I never, ever, ever know the syntax for CSS transforms and gradients, but I know how to find it out. So it's fine not to know things. But what worries me is how many people say, because I don't know, then nobody should know, and this is not worth knowing. John Ressig, who was a great friend of mine, he invented jQuery, and he's a fellow Japanese art lover, said, in my opinion, this poll is a great advertisement for CSS and JS. Things like this are always opaque, confusing, and incredibly hard to reason about. Well, bollocks. I think fat arrows and this in JavaScript. JavaScript is opaque, confusing, and incredibly hard to reason about. But that doesn't mean it's wrong and evil. It just means I don't know. But this gets me. The fact that you could look at HTML and not know how to render is just silly. No, it's the point. Because HTML is the content, and you will never know how it will render. Sorry, John, you got it wrong. Somebody else, who I'm named because I couldn't be bothered to Photoshop it out, but I don't know who they are. For what it's worth, mentally parsing CSS specificity rules is a skill I don't want my employers or co-workers to have. Another friend of mine, Paul, said, I once passed a JavaScript hiring test using pure HTML and CSS. Why? Because you only need CSS in many cases, and being able to identify those cases is a serious programming skill. Although I'm proficient in JavaScript now, HTML and CSS are still my semantic bread and butter. I say, of course a developer should know CSS inside out, understand cascade and inheritance. It's a foundational technology of the most democratic comms technology ever invented. If you don't know CSS, you are not a front-end developer, you are a script kiddie. Other opinions are available. I can understand why, sorry, the contract I signed said I was not allowed to blaspheme in this temple of science, but it didn't say anything about pictures of arses. I can understand why people get this confused, though, because we're in the era of components, and I love component-based development, because in the 80s, I was a programmer running programs on a VAX VMS where you could only have 8K in memory, so everything had to be components. This is my bread and butter. This is how I learned. I love components because reusability, composability, testability, shareability. And I agree and acknowledge with Cristiano Rastelli's diagram the separation of concerns between JavaScript, CS, and HTML, and this fetishism we had for keeping them separate, is not necessarily right in an era of components. The functionality is the concern, but I do still say that you don't use JavaScript to do the job of CSS. You use CSS to do the job of CSS. And I acknowledge that, you've all seen this GIF, I acknowledge that styling components and making sure they don't leak across components boundaries can be particularly complex. Because everything in CSS is global. Order affects cascade. The dependency system is a bit ropey. And yeah, CSS relies upon markup structure. It has always been untrue that you can separate HTML from CSS completely, because your CSS is depending upon descendant selectors or class names or whatever. And it can break silently. To your average JavaScript person, full stack developer, whatever they like to call themselves, this is their app sailing across the internet sea with all of their components neatly stacked. And then they try and style it with CSS, and oh, fucking hell, everything's on fire. And so they blame CSS. There's a tremendous amount of memorization of unexpected behaviors, rules and names and other idiosyncrasies. They're only unexpected if you don't know how it works. And if you don't know how it works, then of course things are not expected. But good old CSS has so many great things. You have IDE support, you get syntax highlighting and code completion, you get validation, you get CSS generators, and you get a huge community of people who know how to do CSS. And these people are not second-class citizens in this glorious world of programming on the web. Any designers in the house? Well, thank you for getting up this early. When I was at Wix developing this open source product that we released, we were very interested because we had lots and lots of really well-paid designers. And nobody designs in Photoshop now. Design on the web is done in CSS. And so we asked, or actually somebody else asked, but I copied the results down. Designers were asked, what's your biggest gripe with CSS in JS? And after my cheap joke at designers, I'm giving you the courtesy of doing some special typography here, because this is designers speaking. So always having to remember to camel case properties, then spending 10 minutes pulling out your hair when you forget. The cryptic domain-specific languages that do everything just so slightly differently were designers' gripes on CSS and JS. When I test look and feel in a browser, I copy-paste from the inspector, only have to rewrite it as a JSON object. It makes you less productive. Lack of linting, autocomplete, and CSS plugins for colors incrementing, etc. Not a gripe. but a concern. Performance. Yeah, because the browser has been around for 20 odd years. Some of the finest C++ coders in the world have optimized the hell out of browsers' CSS engines. Your JavaScript will not be faster to squirt down the wire, then to be parsed, then to be executed, then a DOM constructed, and your styles applied on a $60 Android phone in rural Indonesia. It will not be faster than Chrome or Firefox or Edge's built-in CSS engine. I guarantee you. Loading a JavaScript library to handle CSS creation at runtime is slow and costly. Creating and modifying style sheets at runtime is slow and costly. And if you're doing server-side rendering, which you should do, you're just doing everything twice. So we made something called Stylable. I'm not going to go too much into that. It is static styling for web components. It happens at build time, like SAS or less, not runtime. And my job at Wix, I finished it, my job was to make this compatible with CSS syntax so that the designers who write CSS weren't obliged to go and learn something different for the convenience of developers. Their tools and their skill sets were respected. So we had this vendor prefix, ST, for stylable, which is transpiled away at build time, so it never actually hits the browser. But it means that all of this is valid CSS syntax, so all of the IDEs and syntax highlighters would work. And using pseudo classes, pseudo elements, you could reach inside the components without any knowledge of the HTML structure in order to do the styling at build time, so it's performant. I'm happy to recommend this, although I have nothing to do with Wix anymore because we released it as BDSM, so it's open source. Try it out. I think it's great, and I don't work there anymore. But we're still not learning. There is more and more JavaScript being squirted down the wire every year, even though we know that the vast majority of people coming to the web are on slower networks and slower devices. The median mobile site sends 361 kilobytes of JavaScript. The median WordPress mobile site is bigger than the median desktop WordPress website. What's that about? I love WordPress, I use it. Alex Russell, who's a sinister mastermind at Google, who invented all of the things that are good, but 10 years ago and nobody believed him. He said recently, we cannot continue to use as much JavaScript as is now normal and expect the web to flourish. To get this fixed, we need to confront the developer experience bait and switch. Tools that cost the poorest users to pay wealthy developers are bunk. And yet, you are charging your users because they are paying for the bandwidth to download all of your unnecessary JavaScript. In Germany, to afford a 500 megabyte a month's mobile broadband package, you have to work 1 hour at national minimum wage. In the States, you have to work 6 hours. In Brazil, you have to work 35 hours to afford 500 megs of mobile broadband a month. And if you're sending down 360 kilobytes of JavaScript when you could be sending CSS, you are making this person work harder, and that's naughty. In Nigeria, watching 2 minutes of online video a day can cost more than sending your child to school. Is your video so important? So yeah, being a Shokunin is a social obligation to do your best for the general welfare of the people. Be one of the good guys. I tried to use, I remembered ages ago I saw a wonderful t-shirt of Mother Teresa and Princess Diana sitting on a cloud in heaven. So I tried to find that image for being one of the good guys, and I couldn't. This is the only image I could find of Mother Teresa and Princess Diana in heaven. But I would point out that it's the power of the internet that Richard Linford can sell his framed print for $22,000. God bless you, Mr. Linford, and good luck with your art. This is the first ever website. Look, it's responsive. Amazing. Look, I can tab through links and I can see where I am and I can just click on a link and go there. Amazing. Not, because this is how the internet was designed unless you decide to break it. Sir Uncle Timbo said, the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everybody, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. And I feel bad because years ago, Patrick Lauker and I used to get bored of people quoting this in accessibility talks. We got so bored that we made our own fictional Sir Tim Berners-Lee quote generator. Was it not Tim Berners-Lee who said, "It's Sir Timothy to you, Sonny, not Timbo"? Was it not Tim Berners-Lee who said, "Oh, this old thing I bought at Rosina Warrior Princess Convention"? Was it not Tim Berners-Lee who said, "Can you take the bin bags out, love? I'm dying for a crap"? Was it not Sir Tim Berners-Lee who said, "Why would blind people want to use a computer anyway"? It wasn't, of course. But accessibility is not just for people with disabilities, people who are blind, or people like me who have multiple sclerosis, or people with Parkinson's. It's for everybody. In a landmark study recently by these three people, whose names I cannot pronounce because they're probably like Trina from Lapland, a study of 61 people without disabilities used one of three websites with having different levels of accessibility. Those websites with a high level of accessibility led to better performance, task completion, and task completion rate than low accessible websites for people who did not have a disability. Likewise, high web accessibility improved user ratings, perceived usability, aesthetics, workload, and trustworthiness compared to sites with low accessibility. Therefore, accessibility is part of usability. High conformance with web accessibility guidelines provides benefits to users without disabilities, and accessibility is not complicated. Unfortunately, the world of accessibility is one in which if you have 3 web accessibility practitioners in a room, there will be 72 different opinions about anything. But the core stuff is really simple. The hardest stuff is accessibility with web components, and that's getting easier with the new accessibility object model. If you're interested in that, James Craig from Apple and Alice Boxhall from Google are doing great work. Another vital thing about the web is decentralization. Sir Uncle Timbo said, there's no central authority, no central controlling node, no single point of failure. This implies freedom from indiscriminate censorship and surveillance. This is Myanmar, Burma. Before the country democratized, or before there was at least the attempt to appear democratic, a SIM in Burma cost $2,000 US, and it went down to $1.50. Suddenly, everybody could afford a SIM, everybody had a mobile, and everybody had Facebook, even though they'd never had access to the web before. Suddenly, Facebook was full of stuff like this. May the terrorist dog Kalars fall fast and die horrible deaths. Kalar is an insulting term for the Rohingya Muslims. And what happened? A massive genocide and an exodus of hundreds of thousands of people. And it's not just Burma. Carsten Muller and Carlos Schwarz at the University of Warwick looked at every anti-refugee attack in Germany. They analysed the local community by any variable that seemed relevant. Wealth, demographics, support for far-right politics, newspaper sales, number of refugees, history of hate crimes, number of protests. Wherever per person Facebook use rose to one standard deviation above the national average, attacks on refugees increased by about 50%. Now, I use Facebook because it's the only way I can talk to my aunties and my cousins and old school friends who are not in tech. I'm not anti-Facebook per se, but I'm anti-people who require me to use it. So, for example, if you have sign-in, don't force me to use Facebook or Google or Twitter. Offer me them, sure, and I choose not to. I choose not to give more of my data to people who make big money and choose not to do things that would help protect people in vulnerable situations like the Rohingyas in Burma. This is a far-right website that I had the misfortune to look at, a Brexiting, Trump-loving, racist place. They were moaning because some mad person in the States wasn't allowed to write on Facebook anymore. So why are Twitter and Facebook setting themselves as judge and jury as people post their opinions? They should be shut down. They are not democratic. They commented on the Facebook comments plugin. Even the only way to comment on this website was with Facebook. Don't do that. Give people a choice. Coral is an open source commenting system developed by Mozilla. You can grab it for free. It's really good. Give people the alternative. Not everybody wants to use Facebook just to make your life easier. Because everybody in this room earns a living on the internet. I earn a good living, and I've traveled around dozens of countries and stayed in lovely hotels at other people's expense, doing a job that I could never have even guessed existed, even when I graduated in the 80s. The internet's been good to me. The internet's been good to you. Pass that gift on. The internet matters. Oh, by the way, this site is really good. This is the kind of weirdly named nappy.co, and it's royalty-free images of people of color that you can use for free in order to have better representation of women of color on the internet. So nappy.co for your stock images of people. The internet matters. An increase in internet maturity, similar to the one that we've experienced in the last 5 years, creates an increase of real GDP per capita, per person, of $500 US. It took the industrial revolution of the 19th century 50 years to produce the same results. And developing countries are home to 94% of the global offline population. These arguably are people for whom the internet has much more impact in their life than the ability to go lol at the picture of your friend's cat. For example, some people live miles away from the nearest healthcare facility, but a feature phone and a free copy of Where There Is No Doctor, translated into their local language, is medical care. There are countries in the world, of course, where education is unaffordable for many people, but with a feature phone and a web browser and World Reader, they have access to thousands and thousands of free books online, which is an education for many, many people. There are countries in the world run by mad people who believe that if you have the wrong sexuality, the wrong religion, or the wrong political viewpoint, you should be murdered. And these people are not free. But the internet gives them access to the free world. As an Egyptian internet activist said, if you want to liberate a country, give them the internet. Because the web is not just loads of computers. It's not these clouds. It's not a series of tube. It's these African women. It's this blind guy in Canada. It's these women I photographed on a bus in Bangladesh. It's this woman in a wheelchair in Korea. It's this farmer and his granddaughter in Cambodia. It's these bros watching a football match. It's these Indian women I photographed on a beach. It's this guy with Down syndrome in the New York subway. It's for everyone. Thank you.